Good morning. It's Monday and Holy Week, and I hope this finds you doing well. I'm here this morning because I wanted to speak briefly about Mary Magdalene. She's one of the people I had planned to teach and talk about as part of our Lenten series, Journey to Jerusalem. And then, as we all know, things changed, and we weren't gathering in person for the second half of Lent, and so I never got to speak about Mary Magdalene. So I wanted to present a little bit about her, and especially right here in Holy Week, because hers is an important story to tell, although it often stands in the shadows. In some of our Gospels, she is literally standing in the shadows, but I also think in our church history and to some extent in our liturgies, she too is standing in the shadows there. And I feel like it's important and right and good and joyful for us to spend some time focusing on her, because she actually plays a very prominent role and one that's not lifted up. And so I'd like to take a little bit of time this morning to do so. And I wanted to do so by sharing with you a couple of paintings of her that you should have on the screen in front of you. They're taken from the St. Albans Psaltery from the 12th century. And I came by these paintings. I came by the one on the right originally because Elaine Druzedo put me on to her and in fact shared the one on the right with me. But in the actual Psaltery, they're side by side in the book. And the St. Albans Psaltery, I don't know if you've heard of it before, but it was an illuminated manuscript. I'd never heard of it, but basically an illuminated manuscript was kind of like a picture book of sorts that had beautiful paintings, often made in monasteries, and these paintings were used to illustrate stories from the Bible. And it helped, and they did that, they made these paintings because they were helpful to people who couldn't read, which was a large portion of the population. So the two paintings you have in front of you are unique. They're unique for several reasons, one of which is that they included women, and we didn't have so many paintings that did that. And then the other reason is because in that painting on the right, you'll see Mary Magdalene is depicted and named. The name of that painting is Mary Magdalene, Apostle to the Apostles. Apostle to the Apostles, I mean. And I bet that's not a title you've ever heard before in speaking about Mary Magdalene. I bet it's not something you were taught in church. I bet most of you, when you hear the word apostle, think immediately of the 12 apostles, the 12 male apostles. And yet, here we have Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles. So what does that word mean, apostle? Well, it means one who is sent on a mission. And it comes from the classical Greek, which means one who is sent off. The literal meaning in English is an emissary. And in the Gospel of John and in the other Gospels, it is Mary Magdalene who's literally asked by Jesus to go as an emissary and tell the others what she's seen and heard. She's the only person mentioned by name in every Gospel as being present, as being sent off, but also as being present at the empty tomb. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, she's part of a group of 3 women. In John, she's alone, at least after Simon Peter and John run off and are afraid. But Mary Magdalene, she's ever present in these stories, and if we take some time and pay attention to that, we'll realize what a valuable role that she played. They have this term in scholarship, it's called multiple attestation. And so in the Gospels, if a story or a person shows up multiple times in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's considered really significant, because it means that however different and widespread those early stories of the Christian faith were, this particular story or this particular person showed up again and again. And so it's significant that we see Mary Magdalene showing up at these key places over and over again. And so as we talk about that and think about what that means, I want to look particularly at the Gospel of John, because it's there where we get this rich portrayal of Mary Magdalene, and Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb, and specifically with Jesus. So if you want to take a moment to pause this and get your Bible and turn in chapter 20 to verses 1 through 18 and read through that story, it might be a little bit easier to follow along. But take a moment to read that story and then come back and we'll talk about it. And what you'll notice after you've read it, and what becomes immediately clear, is that it's this richly textured narrative. And in the narrative, there are all these pivots and turns along the way. There's just a lot going on here. There's a lot of detail given, more than is often given in Bible stories. And I want to take just a minute to talk about what some of those details were. So in this narrative in John, Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb where Jesus has been laid. She was at the crucifixion. She stood in the shadows watching. She saw Jesus crucified, and now she's returned to the tomb. And when she does, she finds that the stone's been rolled away. So she runs immediately to get some of the others, and she goes and tells Simon Peter and probably John that the stone's been rolled away, and they run back to the tomb with her. You get this funny scene where Simon, Peter, and John get in a little foot race to see who can get there first. But when they arrive, they see the empty tomb and they're terrified, and so they run off. And Mary's left there alone. And John captures this clearly, kind of starkly. He writes, Mary Magdalene stood weeping outside the tomb. So let's pause just a moment and think about that for a minute. She's gone to get the others. They've all raced back together. And then the other two run off in fear, and Mary Magdalene stays at the tomb. So remember, she just days earlier has seen Jesus crucified. She's come back to the tomb, maybe to anoint his body, maybe simply to be with the one that she'd followed in her life and who's now dead. But she's come back to the empty tomb where she was hoping to at least come and to be with Jesus. Mary Magdalene here is the embodiment of sorrow. She's the embodiment of despair and grief. But notice how in the midst of her grief, in the midst of that despair, she stays at the empty tomb. She doesn't know why. She doesn't even necessarily come there with any hope other than being with Jesus simply. She's the embodiment of presence with her Lord. Well, we know that eventually in this narrative, she decides that she is going to go and peek into the emptiness of the tomb. So she goes to the tomb and she looks into this hollowness. She has no idea what she'll find, and there she sees two angels. Now it's interesting. Did she know they were angels? Maybe not, because she asks them, "Where have you taken his body?" She talks to them as though they're two people in the tomb. Notice that she's intent on keeping vigil with Jesus. She wants to know where he is so that she can be with him. Notice Mary's role here. Her role is presence, being present with Jesus, being present with herself and her own grief. So she sees the angels, and before they can even respond, she hears something behind her. And she turns and she sees someone who she thinks is the gardener. Now that seems kind of strange to us because we know that it's Jesus, and yet she doesn't recognize him. We might think that she would recognize him immediately, but she doesn't. There's this moment that she doesn't understand. But notice too, even then, she says to the gardener, "Sir." She accords him this honor, um, this respect, but she doesn't know who he is. And that's interesting because in the Gospel of John, there's this fascinating common theme of sight. Who has it? Who doesn't? How do we come to sight? How do we even know when we're blind? And in the Gospel of John, sight isn't something that's always immediately apparent, even to the closest followers of Jesus. A couple of weeks back, we read from the Gospel of John about the blind man, and you might remember that Jesus created this paste. He spit and he rubbed it in the mud, and then he placed it on the blind man's eyes, and he gains his sight. But what's interesting in that story is after he gains his sight, Jesus and the blind man go on their separate ways, and then a little bit later, the blind man is encountering he's gotten into some conflict with the religious authorities, and they've driven him out of town. Jesus gets word of this, and he comes, and the blind man, when he first sees Jesus, he says, "Sir." Again, like Mary, he calls Jesus "Sir," even though he doesn't know who he is. And it's only after Jesus speaks to him that he becomes aware of who it is, that this is the Jesus who had healed him. So again, we have this theme, and it's throughout John. If you read the whole Gospel of John, you see it coming up again and again. Who is blind? Who sees? How do we come to have sight? What are our blinders? And we see here with Mary Magdalene that it's a process. It's not something that's immediately or always clear to her, but we also see her continuing to move forward in faith. So she sees this man, she thinks he's the gardener, and Jesus calls her by name. And she recognizes him immediately, and she returns calling him by name, Rabboni, which means teacher. And so we have here in the empty tomb, this beautiful, tender moment. This tender moment where Jesus calls her by name and she recognizes him. Where there's this reunion that's come out of despair. And it all happens in the emptiness of the tomb, which is so interesting to me. We see this deep, intimate encounter of Jesus with Mary Magdalene, but it's all at the empty tomb. So Mary Magdalene's overcome with joy, and Jesus tells her not to hold on to this moment, that she can't stay in this place very long, but to take the power of this moment and to go and share it with all the others. And so she does. And so we get this title, we start to understand what it means for Mary Magdalene to be the apostle to the apostles. I want to talk briefly about Mary Magdalene and the other Gospels because I think it's important to see how and where she shows up there too. In Mark, which is thought of to be the earliest Gospel, Mary Magdalene, as well as in Luke and Matthew, she's one of 3 women at the tomb. She's not alone. That's only in the Gospel of John. But here she's one of a group of women. This is what Mark writes in his Gospel. He writes, "There were other women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome." And then he says, and this is interesting, "They used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee." And then he says, "And there were many other women who had come with him to Jerusalem." So what's interesting is Mary Magdalene shows up again, but then there are these other women, and he even names that there were many other women who'd been traveling with Jesus. but it's these women who show up at the empty tomb to anoint Jesus' body for burial. And then interestingly, in Mark's gospel, there are two endings. And the first one, which is considered the earliest ending, it's just this very dramatic ending to the Gospel of Mark. So the women come to the tomb and they meet an angel at the tomb, and it says they fled in terror and amazement and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's right where it ends. And that was the original dramatic ending to the Gospel of Mark, our earliest gospel. But then a second ending was added to that. Maybe somebody just couldn't take the ending on that dramatic note. And so someone wrote later a second ending to Mark. And this one is one where Mary Magdalene comes in and is mentioned by name. And it says that Jesus appears to her, and he tells her there to go and tell the others. So again, this theme of Mary Magdalene and Jesus meeting one another, and then her being sent as emissary to tell the others. So the first ending, it's a group of women who the angels meet. The second ending, it's Mary Magdalene meeting Jesus, who tells her to go and tell the others. In Matthew and Luke, they also have Mary Magdalene included as a group of women. And in Matthew, there's this interesting encounter. The women are at the tomb. They meet an angel who tells them to go and tell the others, which they do. And then along the way, this group of women encounter Jesus. And he says to them, peace. He offers them this assurance that all is well. And they as a group have this encounter, and they're overcome with joy, and then they go to proclaim the good news. And then finally in Luke, again, Mary Magdalene, part of a group of women. This time the three are Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and then another name, Joanna. So that's a name we haven't heard before at the empty tomb. But what's interesting is in Luke, all of these women have been mentioned earlier in the gospel. So to conclude our time, I want to share a particular way of looking at Mary Magdalene. And I want us to think about her faith not simply as linear, although that's important. In a linear sense, she is with Jesus every step of the way, following him in his ministry, learning from him, then being present at his crucifixion, staying with him at the tomb, staying with him and staying with herself, even in that place of grief, and then meeting him and having an encounter with him where she's sent on to tell the other disciples. But there's another way, too, to think about her faith, and it's a bit more of a circular kind of way, because for her, the journey of faith, it's not always static. It was always changing and shifting and moving forward in faith and in trust. And along the way, there are these moments of clarity and there are these moments of uncertainty. There's grief and there's joy. There's confusion and there's recognition. There's community. There are others at the tomb with her, but then there's solitude. And it's all right there. All of these pieces of her faith are captured at the empty tomb, and she's at the very heart of that. So when we're thinking about faith and how she might help shape or inform our own journeys, I think it's helpful to think of it in this linear sort of way where we're moving forward in this progression. But I also think it's helpful to remember that there was a circular aspect to it, that faith wasn't always immediately clear, and then you move forward to the next thing. But for Mary Magdalene, it was about moving forward in trust and in hope, as much as it was sort of knowing each step along the way. And I think that's particularly helpful right now when we find ourselves in this place where we're moving through Holy Week, but we also find ourselves in a difficult world and seeing suffering all around us and thinking about how is it that we move forward. And we have Mary Magdalene here as this witness to steadfastness, to being willing to stay in the empty place and to wait, to being open to encounter with the Christ. And in the midst of being open to encountering the Christ, staying deep within her own core of who she was as well. In the empty tomb, she continues to address the person that is Jesus as Sir. There's this sense that she still has a presence of herself, even in her own grief and despair. And even as she has that, you see her having this openness to meeting and encountering Christ when he comes. So I think that's a helpful witness for all of us, not only moving through Holy Week, but in this time in which we find ourselves. So may God be with each of us. May God's peace guide us. And I'll look forward to seeing you later this week.